Hello and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. Today I'm back with Vincent to discuss the unrelenting genocide of Palestinians by Israel. We want to draw a balance sheet of the pro-Palestinian struggle and give our own communist assessment of the movement and how to advance the fight for Palestinian liberation. Welcome back, Comrade.
Hello.
So, the genocidal war against Gaza by Israel is in its 19th month. Israel is unrelenting. There have been huge demonstrations in this period around the world in support of Palestine. We've seen many in places in the West, and others, for example, in Yemen, seen really massive demonstrations. Just marked the 77th anniversary of the Nakba, which saw, again, huge demonstrations around the world. But to put it very frankly, what has been the result of the pro-Palestinian movement? Israel has not been defeated, and as of right now, tens of thousands of Gazans face death by starvation. So how do we make sense of what's going on? Why hasn't the movement been able to do more to push back the Israeli onslaught?
I think it's important to be frank and look at reality soberly. There's been a huge movement of solidarity. Millions of people actually got into politics around Palestine across the world, and the Palestine question has been put at the center of political debates for the last 19 months. However, one thing that I think many leftists fail to do or fail to acknowledge is the fact that the movement has been constantly on the retreat. Israel has been able to wage a genocidal war, to murder a ton of Palestinians in the West Bank. The pressure on Israel has been increasing to steal even more land with the settlers. In the Arab world, despite huge demos, no regime has really intervened decisively to stop that genocide. And in the West, the mass movement that we saw for months is actually right now on the defensive and coming under increasing repression, particularly since the election of Trump, however that was going on before. And I think very few tendencies on the left have tried to take a minute and ask themselves, well, why is that so? What lessons can be drawn from the last 19 months of struggle and how to go forward? That's sort of the goal of the sort of balance sheet we tried to do in the recent article of Spartacist, which is titled After October 7, Where Are We Now? And so I think it'd be good to go through some of these points and for Palestinian militants to really try to get a little more to the nub of the political question as to why the Palestinian movement is in such a difficult position. And I think the first starting point in order to look at it is that, yes, Israel has been able to wage a devastating military campaign on Gaza. Yes, it has done so with the support of the United States and the UK and, pretty much the entire Western world. But you cannot only look at the military superiority of the Zionist state as well as its backers. The main thesis we argue is basically the reason why the Palestinian movement finds itself in a very difficult situation and on the back foot is also due to its own politics. Yes.
Why don't we start with the politics of the Palestinian resistance?
Yes.
The whole episode that led to this huge genocidal assault.
Yeah.
So talking about the Palestinian resistance, I think based on my appreciation of events, there's either the tendency to, maybe not directly support, but to be quite uncritical about the events of October 7th on the one hand, or on the other, to just not take stock of the problems of that strategy and just cheer on, empty liberal solidarity and things like intifada, socialism, revolution. But we've tried in this article to actually deal with what is the strategy and why has this, what's wrong with it, essentially. So if you could walk us through that.
Yeah. It's an important question because you have to start with October 7. And I say that with a lot of qualifying a lot because I know Zionists are always banging on about October 7 as if October 7 was the beginning of this entire war. Now, we know very well, and we assume, our listeners will understand that our starting point is that this whole war began 1947 with the Nakba, or even before, you could say, with the oppression of the Palestinian by the Israeli state. I just want to make that clear for our listeners that, we are not of the view that this whole conflict started on October 7. Obviously not. It's decades of oppression. However, the current war did start on that day. And so you do have to look at that day a little bit. I think October 7 is a bit difficult as well to deal with many on the left because that has been really the argument used by the Zionists, by the the forces supporting Israel. And it's been difficult for many in the movement to deal with it, or some don't want to deal with it. Some just uncritically support it or critically support it. Many just ignore the question. But I think it's important to look at it because I think from the standpoint of the Palestinian liberation struggle, which is our standpoint, how to advance the fight to free Palestine, it's important to look at this event because already you see in the strategy which led to this operation, some of the problems which are going to plague the Palestinian resistance throughout the 19 months we're seeing. And so October 7 was based, and the subsequent struggle of the resistance was based on a number of false assumptions and political problems on the part of the resistance movement. So the goal of October 7 was really to deal a massive blow to Israel, to show a show of strength in comparison to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and to really, sort of shook Israel. And they did so with obviously massacring hundreds of civilians. Yeah. I'll get to this in a minute. I think we can summarize maybe the political problems plaguing the resistance in sort of 4 points in general. So the first one is that the strategy of the resistance assumed that U.S. imperialism following this attack would sort of intervene and force Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. And it assumed as well, which is sort of the second assumption, that the U.S. would be forced to do this through pressure from the international community, public opinion, and protest movements. And then the third assumption of the resistance was that obviously October 7 was going to ignite a new war, and that Iran and the axis of resistance would be forced to declare a regional war against Israel. And the fourth assumption by the Palestinian resistance was that chaos in Israel was so great that the military would sort of crumble from within. Israel had saw mass demonstration against Netanyahu in the year before. There was a lot of turmoil and a lot of polarization inside Israeli society. And so we can walk through a little more these particular assumptions, but these were all underpinning the military strategy of the resistance. And so if I go through the first one, it's like U.S. imperialism would be forced to sort of make concession and restrain Israel. And it was the assumption that because the power of the U.S. is weakening, they would be more forced to concede, to retreat from their sphere of influence, to avoid, obviously, a regional war. And what the war has shown is that, in fact, as the U.S. power is weakening, sort of the opposite is true, because they have even more to rely on their Israeli attack dog, the United States. The U.S. must bolster even more Israel as an military outpost for the U.S. in the Middle East. And so already that first assumption was a mistake in the sense of U.S. hegemony. If we go to the second one, like the pressure from the international community. So there was the belief that, this big shock, which would ignite a war, would really lead to multiple countries to sort of want to put pressure on the U.S. and Israel to really restrain them. It was really wishful thinking to believe that the Western countries or even the Arab regimes, which are totally subservient to the United States, that they would really defy U.S. dictates and that they would really go against the U.S. And as for the protest movements in the West or elsewhere, they really remained dominated by either liberal forces or nationalist forces. Well, in the West, mainly, they were really dominated by liberal forces. And throughout the Middle East, really, often the protest movements were sponsored directly by the regimes in place, or else were led by forces whose politics were similar to the Palestinian resistance movement. And in all these cases, the impulses of the masses who wanted to fight back against genocide were restrained and are still restrained.
So it's really the political program of the movements and the leadership of the pro-Palestinian struggles that were hampering the real desire to fight on behalf of Palestine and Palestinian liberation.
Yes. Yeah. So if you take a country like Turkey, the demonstrations were often organized directly by Erdogan's party and the regime in place, and sort of used as a way to shore up Erdogan's regime, or else became a political football between the Kemalist and Erdogan. And in both these cases, you have massive demonstrations because there's such a support, but at the same time, they're really restrained. They're actually a way to blow off steam, to sort of cover for the fact that these regimes could do much more to stop Israel. They are not, but organizing mass demonstrations serves as a way, sort of a blow off steam. I think that's the best expression to summarize it. And that you've seen this a lot in the Arab world as well. You've seen this in Egypt, for example, is a good example of this sort of restraining their impulses.
Yeah, we'll get to this later, but I think the problem of looking to the Arab regimes has historically plagued the Palestinian struggle as well, right?
Yeah.
Really looking to their allies in the Muslim world and how they have time and again betrayed them for their own narrow interests. And that is still a problem that we continue to see today. I mean, just look at how chummy Donald Trump is being with the Gulf states currently.
Yes.
Okay, so going on
Yes.
to the third assumption.
Yes, and it's linked to the second, really. It's because it was really that the resistance movement in Palestine thought that it would ignite a regional war. It would drag Iran and the axis of resistance into war with Israel. And that is really what you just spoke about. This allusion to the look to the Arab states or other states to really intervene on behalf of the Palestinians has always been at the center often of the Palestinian resistance strategy, when it was the PLO or later on with the current organizations. And here's the thing, is like whether it is the Arab regime or the Iranian Republic or even Hezbollah in Iran, these are forces which will always put their own internal stability, their own narrow interests, their own rule, essentially balancing their own contradiction internally above that of the Palestinians. So they'll do just enough for the Palestinians to really sort of satisfy the massive impulses that exist among the masses there to support the Palestinians, but it will also restrain the movement in the fear that it will really go beyond them. So that's what. So obviously, this is linked to the second point I was just making. But I think it was really a huge mistake to put basically a lot of your eggs in your basket on the Islamic regime and that they would necessarily intervene. And if we get into it a little more, like the Iranian regime's doctrine over Israel is called the strategic patience. So this is sort of it's also shared by Hezbollah. It's the doctrine which says that we will slowly grind Israel, waging a long-term war of attrition against Israel and the US, gradually draining their military power side by side with like diplomatic appeals and the international community and international law. And that's the goal of the various proxies that Iran has. And it's sort of slowly grinding this approach. And what the war has revealed is that the doctrine of strategic patience really conceded all the initiative to Israel and the US, who were, always willing to escalate. And that's what we've been saying. So that's what we've been seeing. Sorry. And so I think this was this third assumption that the axis of resistance would step in really represented a form of blind faith, I believe, in the Islamic regime or Hezbollah, which proved in this case really fatal.
Yeah, the imperialists and the Zionists, they have plenty of patience. We can just see nothing's been able to stop them. I don't know what attrition they're talking about. Like they've got plenty of weapons, plenty of manpower, plenty of will to keep going. And I think the really criminal thing about this is that to speak of this kind of a strategy when there is a genocide going on, that really is I don't even know what word to use, but like how much patience can you have when there's a genocide happening? But I think when you were speaking about relying on the Islamic regimes and so on, I think Lebanon, what happened with the brief episode when Israel invaded Lebanon and how quickly the resistance force in Lebanon folded and struck their own deal with Israel. I think that's a very concrete way of seeing that, what we're saying is not just our own kind of analysis of these regimes, but this is time and time again how it has played out in reality.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good example with Hezbollah. And with Iran, it's the same, which is playing the leadership role here. A lot of their authority in the masses rests on supporting Palestine. At the same time, however, they must balance a really difficult economic situation, a restless population. The Iranian regime has been quite shaky since the massive demonstration in 2022. The hope that they can cut a deal with the US to alleviate the sanctions. That's much higher on the list of priority than whatever, declaring war on Israel. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into detail. There are factions in the regimes which are much more hardline. There are reformists, but in general, it's that balancing act which has led to really impotence and paralysis. So I think it's important for the pro-Palestinian movement to look at this impotence and paralysis, not only in terms of military superiority or term, but really rooted in a political outlook, which has proven by the war to be false and leading to catastrophe. Same thing with Hezbollah as well. Hezbollah is an organization that has to balance the sectarian war in Lebanon, that has its own interests there, which, yes, forces it to sometimes escalate and retaliate against Israel, but at the same time, which is forced to find a deal as well with the Israeli regime and must cohabit with it. So it's this balancing act in both the Iranian case and the whole forces of the axis of resistance, which has led to this wavering, essentially.
Yeah. As you're speaking, I'm just anticipating the detractors, because I think Iran especially, they are called the axis of resistance, right? So I can anticipate that we might face many disagreements amongst the left and the pro-Palestinian movement that, well, no, these are anti-imperialist forces. They are fighting on behalf of the Palestinian people and for Palestinian liberation. And I think it's to really insist on the point that you've just made, that yes, there are contradictions, but ultimately these regimes, they have to conciliate the pressures in their own respective societies, and therefore can't take that struggle to its logical conclusion.
I think it's pretty obvious for many, many Palestinian militants that Iran or even Hezbollah did not play a good role in this war, did not stood up for the Palestinians. I mean, look, maybe there are obviously militants from these very organizations that will certainly disagree, but I think it's quite assumed. And I think maybe one of the problems in the Palestinian movement is that there's a strong feeling that criticizing too much the leadership of the resistance organization means giving in to the Zionists, means giving in to those who are genociding. But really, you can only stop the genocide if you start first by understanding what went so wrong. These organizations were put to the test with this massive war. And in the case of the many in the axis of resistance, test really has been failed. You have to actually confront the mistakes and the problems, which were, there was massive security breach in Hezbollah. Then they signed a ceasefire after they said they wouldn't, and then their entire leadership was decapitated. Now, obviously, this is, that's Israel is the main responsible for this, but you do have to confront, like, how come was the response so, how to say, mild and quite capitulatory in many ways? Like Iran right now is negotiating with the United States over the nuclear deal, and meanwhile the genocidal campaign is increasing. So this is quite, I think, exposed in many ways how illusions in the axis of resistance and the Iranian regimes have become a catastrophe for the Palestinian struggle. I think it's been shown. So I don't know if that responds to our detractors really, but I think the war itself has shown to many, including those who used to look to Hezbollah or others, like there's been a problem, obviously.
Okay. We write here in the article, I'm just going to read out a little bit. It says, another serious blow for Hezbollah and Iran has been the fall of the hated Assad dictatorship in Syria, which used to guarantee them supply routes for weapons. Now, of course, anytime we want to discuss the Middle East, it's impossible to just talk about one or two countries in isolation from the others, right? Because the whole crisis in the Middle East is it's been engineered by imperialism for decades and decades. So, of course, when you had the fall of Assad, that had implications for what's going on in Palestine and Israel, not to mention, Kurdistan and Turkey and so on. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit about what we mean? Like, how does the Syria question tie into this?
I mean, I'm far from an expert, but obviously the presence of Assad guaranteed like a direct route between Iran and Lebanon. And it was quite important for Hezbollah. And that's why Hezbollah intervened in the Syrian civil war on the side of the Assad regime. So the fall was obviously a blow. But if you take a step back, here's the thing, like Assad was a regime which was really based on the domination of a few sects in Syria over the majority of the country, and really was widely hated in the population. And so Hezbollah intervening to defend that regime already created a lot of divisions and a lot of resentment, including among their own base, but in the broader Middle East, precisely because they were literally defending a dictator which was hated by the population.
It just brings back to mind the whole question of relying on the different regimes in the Arab and Muslim world, right? Yeah. Because one of the points that is essential to our work in the oppressed countries, but I think, the Middle East is one of the most clear examples of this, that you have so many sectarian, ethnic, national divisions in the region, right? Yeah. And the regimes of this or that country will always use that to stoke divisions, between this and that people and pit them in opposition to one another. I mean, we're getting to kind of our political perspective, but I think at the root of this is none of these regimes, the fundamental problem with these regimes, no matter how anti-imperialist they might strike their posture at this or that time, is that they are not interested. They are not interested by the very result of their positions. to actually wage a genuine struggle against US imperialism and Zionism. Because, as you said, building that kind of a struggle is the only way to unite the different groups of people along these various lines of division. But such unity is the very thing that poses a threat to their own rule.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. We wrote an article, which I recommend people go read, that only anti-imperialism can unite the peoples of Syria. And it's essentially the argument we made. Like, I'm not going to go through the whole civil war. That's a whole other can of worm. But it's essentially the capacity of the imperialists to pit different sects, different groups against each other. And then for the militants on the ground, because they always appear to be a greater foe next door than the US imperialist or Israel, are always going to, let's fight this one first, and then we'll see about anti-imperialism. So there you have people siding with Assad, or there you have certain people siding with this or that regime. And that's how the imperialists and the Zionist rulers are able to maintain the whole region pitted against each other in a certain sense. And only a consistent program really opposing US imperialism and its Zionist fortress in the region is possible to bring all these various groups together. But this always require to go against the regime of the mullah, the national bourgeoisies in the various country. And this is where it gets tricky for the revolutionary movement, is to really be able to break that unity which ties those who want to fight for Palestine with the various rulers whose material interests are tied to the very status quo of the region in the Middle East, tied to the very borders which were carved out by the imperialists, tied to the very petty and narrow interests of their regional economy. And so that's why it's really a proletarian and anti-imperialist strategy that's able to really advance the unity of the peoples of the Middle East, precisely because the proletariat, allied with the poor peasant, is not tied to these various narrow national bourgeoisie or property interests. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to summarize our discussion so far, because we've talked about a range of different things. I guess so far, the main point we've tried to make is that lessons need to be drawn from the pro-Palestinian struggle, and that this movement is currently on the back foot. And I think the clearest argument for that is, well, just look what's still happening in Gaza. Nothing has been able to stop. The Palestinian people are facing annihilation. And anybody who thinks that this movement is onwards and upwards is only doing a disservice to the cause of Palestinian liberation, because liberation means that the people have to exist. And if they're facing annihilation, then I'm sorry, but that is not liberation. And I think we have to be, as you said earlier, we have to look at this soberly. And if we want to genuinely advance Palestinian liberation, we have to draw the lessons in order to rearm ourselves and go forward. So far, that's one of the points we've been insisting on by way of the resistance forces in the Middle East region. Now, I want to turn briefly to Israel. And
yes, I was going to go there because we didn't talk about the fourth assumption behind the resistance strategy, but it's about Israel, actually. Yeah. So the fourth assumption behind October 7 and also after the war, but also before the war, is that there were deep divisions in Israel, and it was sort of assumed that with a big shock, they would really crumble. And that's really not understanding the crisis that was going on inside Israel. Divisions inside Israel between like the liberal Zionists and the more sort of right-wing settler movement, they're very deep. Before, you had mass demonstrations and counter-demonstration before October 7. However, a shock like October 7, particularly with its indiscriminate massacre of kibbutzim, festival goers like at the Nova Festival, was obviously not going to exacerbate such division, but was really going to bridge them, cement the entire society behind a genocidal response, or at least make it easier for the Zionist rulers to do so. And it's really these sorts of action. It's always plagued the Palestinian movement, whether it was the PLO before or today the current organization. It's these sorts of actions which attack the civilian populations of Israel always the emboldens all wings of the ruling class and emboldens Zionism in general. Because where does Zionism rests on politically? It rests on the idea that the Israeli state is the only thing that will prevent a new Holocaust. The Israeli state is what defends Jews, against anti-Semitism. That's why it was founded after the Holocaust, after World War II. And by therefore targeting indiscriminately Israeli civilians, you're only emboldening the claim of the Zionist rulers to be the only people defending Jews. And that's also why there's an idea in the Palestinian movement you see often that compare Israel with I don't know, the white regime in apartheid South Africa or like South Vietnam, as if it was some sort of like a paper tiger, that if you kick it, it's going to crumble, that it looks strong, but really it's all, it's ready to crumble. And this is entirely wrong, because there's a real there's a real nation behind that state that is ready to die fighting, precisely because of that ideology of Zionism. And so we can get into the task, but whatever ways the Palestinian movement must defeat certainly Israel and the Zionists. But the only way you can do that is if you're able to drive a wedge between the Israeli population, particularly the Israeli working class, and its Zionist rulers. And you can only do so by undermining the main claims of Zionism, that the Zionist rulers are there to defend all Jews, which is not true, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something we're saying as if it's not controversial. In the left, within the pro-Palestinian movement, there is a strong tendency to completely write off, like, of course, we're against the Zionist state, yes, but with that, there comes the tendency to, just write off Israeli society as a whole, i.e. the working class, that, they benefit from Zionism, from the Zionist state, from the existence of the Zionist state, so therefore they're our enemies and they can never be fighters for the liberation of Palestinians. And we take a strong position against that, right? Yeah. Because again, this is rooted in the material interests of the working class. So one of our tasks is to motivate why actually genuine defense of Jewish people in the region will only come when this garrison state no longer exists, and when there's real alliances amongst Jewish and other Arab peoples in the region. That's their true class brothers and sisters. Yeah. But that's a huge controversy and debate in and of itself. And I'll just alert our readers, we had an article in the previous issue of Spartacus, which I'll link to in the description, but it's called 100 Years of Failure, Marxist on the Palestine question. 100 years of failure. And one of the points is really this question of our perspective to Israel. The only way to defeat Zionism is to undercut the basis of support it has. But that's a whole separate division. As you said, the strategy by the resistance forces that served to basically unify Zionism even more so. And that has actually been counterproductive.
Yeah. So that's what we argue basically for the strategy of the Palestinian resistance movement since particularly with October 7 has been counterproductive, actually. Of course, we have a side with Palestine, which is obviously essential and is the starting point, but it's important to realize this, because if we step back a little bit, despite the fact that October 7 was a serious blow to Israel, really the strategy which drive this blow really contains so much political problem and could only lead to a disaster or a setback in the liberation struggle. Because if you think about it, the resistance knew full well that October 7, it would open a new war. They knew it would devastate Gaza, and they knew also they could not win this thing on their own. And so the strategy really was to offer up Gaza for slaughter in the hope that other forces like the Axis of Resistance, the international community, and even the US would sort of step in to restrain Israel. But then what happened is that actually the indiscriminate massacre of civilians was seized on by the Israeli rulers to openly proceed with genocide. The Israeli government right now is talking openly about like the final solution for the Palestinians. They really seized on this, and it really helped Iran and Hezbollah really spend the war temporizing, wavering, and it's really a weakness that Israel exploited to devastating effect. And the international community, the US really made sure that it wouldn't do anything except, meaningless declarations or UN resolutions. And now the movement, because of its impotence, has been receding in the West, particularly. It's a bit different in the global South, but in the West, at least, it's been, receding. And so you see, there's a famous saying I talked about strategic patience of Iran and the Axis of Resistance, and they have another word for it, which is, quote, boiling the Israeli frog. And we have a thing in the article which say how this tactic, which compared to the saying in the Talmud, there's an old saying which is popular among Jews, which is, if someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. That's a motto really popular in the Mossad and everything. You see how that tactic proved much more devastating than the boiling the Israeli frog thing, obviously.
Okay. So again, as Marxists, we approach situations in terms of what's the balance of forces. And so far, the perspective we're trying to flesh out here is that Israel has not been weakened fundamentally. contrary to the dominant perspective of the pro-Palestinian movement. And in fact, it is the pro-Palestinian movement that has been unable to really decisively push back this assault.
Well, if I can say that on the weekend, like, it's true that Israel has lost many soldiers. It's true that it's much more isolated diplomatically than it was. No, it's true there's much less support for Israel in the broader world. This is all true, but it's often used by a pro-Palestinian militant to say, look at all this, we're winning. However, you have to look at the Palestinian struggle. It's a national liberation struggle. Its success must be measured to how much freedom does the Palestinians gain against the Zionist project. And look at it concretely. In Gaza or in the West Bank, Israel has stepped up and its goal of an Eretz Israel, like an Israel from the river to the sea, completely cleansing the Palestinians. You cannot use these setbacks on the diplomatic level Israel is facing to deny the fact that really on the ground where it matters, the Palestinian struggle has been facing setbacks. And I think that's an important starting point if you want to go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings us back to the false assumptions of the resistance forces, which is, look, now Palestine is known globally. Well, okay, but objectively, the number of Palestinian people alive today, less than before, Yeah. And that is not a situation that is advancing the Palestinian cause. Okay. Now I want to turn to the movements in the West, at least in some of the countries that we've done work in or are more familiar with, because they play out a little bit differently, the nature of these movements. Like, I think fundamentally the same point applies, that these are movements that, despite their rather impressive numbers, if you take a step back and you look over the course of the last 19-20 months, it is undeniable that they have been waning. That's, I think, the first point. Yeah. But second, I think in the West, they've been fundamentally chained to the programs of the left liberals, pro-capitalist forces that have time and time again tied the burning aspirations of youth and Muslims in the West to fight for Palestine. But they've really channeled it into dead-end causes.
Yeah, I think that's important. That's where we do most of our work, obviously. So that's where we probably have the clearest insight. Look, there's, whether you take the U.S., Britain in particular, France, or there is massive support in large layers of the population for the Palestinian cause. Like a comrade in Greece, Anna, was telling me, in Greece, like 100% of the Greek people support Palestine. Like there's basically, 99.9%. And however, the movement hasn't achieved anything. Yep. And I think that's important to realize it. There's been these huge demos, this huge support, but it hasn't achieved anything. So it's important to look at the cause. And what was the cause is that every time you look a little bit carefully in these movements, they are always tied in one way or another, both politically and organizationally, with a wing of the ruling class, which is itself inevitably tied to the U.S. imperialists who are themselves supporting the genocide. Now, if we get concrete, let's take Britain, for example. The demonstrations have been, I think they've been some of the most massive in the Western world in Britain. There's huge support for Palestine in the country. However, the demos are organized on the basis often of liberal politics and crucially led by trade union bureaucrats or laborites, Labour Party politicians, like left-wing Labour Party politicians. And all these forces, trade union bureaucrats or left Labour Party politicians, are tied to the Labour Party, which is now currently in power. It came to power in 2024. And the leadership of the Labour Party is thoroughly Zionist. Totally support Israel. Keir Starmer, famously declared at the beginning of the war that, Israel has the right to cut fuel and water to Palestinians and starve them, basically, and completely committed to Israel. Now, they might have made declarations recently under pressure a little bit because they're losing electoral support everywhere in the country. But really, at bottom, it is a totally Zionist party, the leadership of the Labour Party I'm talking about. And so
absolutely.
When you have the leadership of this movement, which is for Palestine, etc., which will refuse to direct the movement against the Labour Party, the party in power, well, inevitably the methods of the movement, the political demands it will raise, the whole way it is organized will be really demobilized. And concretely, you can see this with what the trade unions do. Britain does send weapons to Israel. They are trade union members who handle them. The trade unions have made speeches at demonstration, leaders like Mick Lynch, etc., but they have not lifted a finger to do anything concrete.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it would piss off the labor leadership. Of course it would. And if we look at the US, it's a bit of a similar process. The movement has been led by like left-wing Democratic Party, who really, during the presidential election, hitched their wagon to Kamala Harris and really made sure, again, organized the movement in a way which would be compatible with Democratic Party politics, which is obviously totally Zionist. And you see similar thing in France. It's been led a lot of time by a Mélenchonist like Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And again, he's very pro-Palestinian. He's actually probably on the most left wing of the political spectrum of all these politicians. He's very known for his support to Palestine. But at the same time, he's a defender of like French republicanism. The way, again, he will seek to organize and push the movement is not to provoke a clash with the entire wing of the imperialist rulers of this country. And so the movement is restrained in different way because of its alliance of a portion of the ruling class, essentially.
Yeah, I just want to come back to what you said about the trade union leaders. That's been a thing that I feel quite strongly about, just because these leaders are able to go to these huge demonstrations. They get prime time. They get a very good platform to really shore up their credentials. But what do they actually do? They do not mobilize their actual working class base to come out and fight against British imperialism, which is a concrete way to help advance the struggle for Palestinian liberation. All it is, ultimately, at the end of the day, all the big trade union leaders, they have done this time and time again over the last year and a half in Britain, and I'm sure in other countries as well. But these are just empty words of solidarity because one, they're materially linked to the Labour Party and therefore are pro-Zionist, maybe not in their personal convictions, but that's their political role. And two, they're not linking the struggle for Palestinian liberation with the struggle at home to fight on behalf of workers to improve their conditions. Why the fight for the NHS must be linked to the fight against British imperialism, which will help advance Palestine. Why the fight for schools, why the fight for trains, etc. All of these things. And I think that's the fundamental crime. So every time I meet a leftist who will say such flowery words, and you have all these banners of the trade unions at the big marches. Let me tell you the reality of that. What that is the activist layer, the retirees of the unions who just have the union banners at home, permanently, and they bring them out on the weekends because it doesn't matter, you're not at work, and they bring them out and they give this air of union presence at these demonstrations when that is just absolutely false. It is absolutely false. If it was a case that the workers were actually mobilized, you would see huge strikes in this country. But that has not been the case.
I think this touches to another problem of the pro-Palestinian movement, because it was organized on like a liberal political outlook. I think the mass movement appeared to a lot of working class people as more of a sort of moral stance that you take.
Exactly. Yeah.
Rather than actually a pole of working class struggle. And I think then we get into which way forward. And I believe one of the big problems of the Palestinian movement in the West has been its incapacity to connect the struggle for Palestine with the struggle with the most minimal needs of workers in the country, whether it is the US or Britain. There is a direct connection between sending weapons to Israel or elsewhere for that matter, and the destruction of the standard of living at home. War abroad create this entire misery we're seeing at home, and they're cutting all services, yet there's always money to send weapons there. And if the pro-Palestinian movement is to rebuild itself in the West, it must definitely be much more anti-imperialists, including against the so-called leftists and trade union leaders who talk about Palestine but keep unity with those Zionists. It much more anti-imperialist, but also much more proletarian, to appeal not so much to the middle class, enlightened liberal middle class, but seek to really connect with the grievances of the working class, which are massive, whether in the US, in Britain, in the West in general. And that's really a point that also applies in the global South, where there is even more support for Palestine for multiple reasons, but where often if you support demonstrations which are organized by the regime in place, or which are organized by, all other areas of forces which don't seek to connect or don't have an answer to the deep needs of the populations in these countries, then it will just be a show of solidarities that will sort of stop there.
I'm so glad you mentioned the point about moralism, because so much of the pro-Palestinian movement thinks that, your job is to just denounce people if they're not talking about Palestine all the time, or or things like that,
You're
right?
complicit. You're
Yeah,
complicit
you're
if you don't.
complicit. Yeah, if you don't raise your voice, you're complicit. I'm sorry, that's false. And that's just one way to alienate people. I think one of the clearest examples of how the movement has been on a totally separate track from the working class is just that, look, you have workers increasingly looking to the right. We had local elections here just a few weeks ago where reform came out rather strong. Right. At the same time, there's an important working class struggle happening here in Birmingham. Right. A lot of those workers look to Farage. But on the other hand, you've got huge mobilizations for Palestine, but they're not actually talking to one another. There's no solidarity between these two things. In fact, they're going in opposite directions. One is more liberal. The other one is, well, why should I care about Palestine? Because I'm getting screwed at home by my boss. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this is a result of as you were explaining, the program driving the Palestinian movement in the West, that it's really not able to actually link the Palestinian cause to the struggle at home for the most basic needs that would actually draw in the broader layers of the working class.
I think a basis for the moralism, and I think it flows from a frustration. There's this genocide, probably the biggest crime of our generation happening in front of our eyes. My social media is full of death constantly. It's very hard.
It is,
and then you have these mass demos, and then nothing comes out of it. And I think it's this moralism of this complicity playing on guilt is really a way, I think, to misdirect this frustration rather than understanding what are the mechanics of the movements which makes it impotent. That is the politics of the leadership and its connection with the ruling class, which restrains it, sort of direct them into yet some sort of hysterical or moralistic appeal. But that inevitably will happen if you cannot develop an understanding of how the movement works, what are its inner workings. The trade unions, if they wanted, they could really mobilize large segments of the working class, tying the fight against austerity, against the destruction of public services, and the fact that we're sending plenty of weapon to kill people. The connection is obvious. If they really wanted to do this, they could. The only reason it's not happening is because it will inevitably piss off people in powers, people they support politically. And I think that's key to understand and to cut through that moralism. It's to understand why the movement is impotent.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to start wrapping up and talk about the way forward. So we've talked about some lessons. I think first and foremost to address reality squarely, which is that the movement is not on the up, but in fact has not been successful in stopping the genocide so far. I think that's just a fact. But that is a fact that unfortunately the left more or less unanimously rejects because they think it's to denounce the struggle. We're not denouncing it, but we are saying that to go forward you need to rebuild this because so far it's not been working. So what do we have to say to those listening about how to rebuild the movement on a better political footing?
Well, we were just talking about the West, and I think in the West, the movement has to be rebuilt or reorient, and it starts with a struggle within the movement. And I think you have to look at the role, for example, that's been played by multiple socialist organizations in the movement. And I think overall, it's certainly true in Britain, it's certainly true in the US. Most socialists have really only cheered on the movement, have helped organize it, which is very well, but only have sort of cheered rather than proposing a Marxist strategy to advance the movement. And as a result, it has led really the grip of liberals or social democratic leader really in charge of the movement. So I think it starts with waging a struggle in your own organizations or in your own group or whatever collective you're in over, well, we cannot continue to have a movement which is led by people who support the ruling class. It starts with this, and it starts by trying to build, maybe it's going to sound abstract, but there's no other way, a anti-imperialist pole within the movement, which is really in complete opposition to the ruling class and to its parties, and that can develop class struggle methods for to advance Palestinian struggle. And that's sort of the second thing. And I would think that the second thing, how to advance the movement, is the movement needs to turn to the working class. It needs to connect to the workers. And I think the best way, I don't have all the answer right this second, but it's really to seek, well, what are the grievances of workers at this place and how are they connected with the foreign policy of the capitalist government? And it's really to draw that connection and show to workers how the struggle for their wages, for housing, for their most basic living conditions must be tied to the struggle against support to Israel and to combat that genocide. I think these are sort of the two aspects. Fight the current leadership, fight whether liberals or nationalists and really go to the workers and speak to their grievances to connect them. I think at least in the West, that's what I would do. Obviously, I think these points also apply in the global South, where there's even more massive support to Palestine. Well, the error of the mistakes of the leadership of the Palestinian movement is always to look to the regime, whether it's the Islamic Republic, whether it was Assad, whether it is other leader Erdogan or whatever. All these these regimes who are utterly corrupt and often directly subservient to the U.S. or often seeking a deal with the U.S. The Palestinian movement must seek to build in the region. You need an anti-imperialist united front against this genocide, and it's urgently needed. I mean, it's needed like a while ago. But the reason it hasn't happened is because these various regimes refuse to do so. They don't want to make a move that's going to anger too much the U.S. or jeopardize their own narrow interests. So the Palestinian resistance movement must really look to the masses and really connect the grievances of the masses who live under these corrupt and reactionary regimes, and connect really the fight against the genocide with the fight for their own liberation from corrupt rulers who end up being open lackeys or subservient to U.S. imperialism too often. So that's sort of general, but I think this is the task. But in all cases, it requires a reorientation. It requires standing up against the current strategy, against the current leadership. Which doesn't mean you help the Zionists in this way, not at all, actually. But you're pointing out what has been hampering the struggle against the Zionist genocide.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we also propose, we're very far from the situation, but we do propose in opposition to the tendency on the left to just outright write off Israel, that actually the task is to fight within that society, to split it along class lines. You could speak about that.
I think this is key as well, because I was talking about an anti-imperialist united front in the Middle East. I think this must also very much include and seek to reach Israeli workers and Jewish Israelis in general. Because without a split in Israeli society from Zionism, the freedom for Palestine will always remain a distant prospect.
Yep.
And so what's the task of communists? We need communists in Israel. They need to be in the trade unions to fight against the so wretched leadership of the trade union in Israel, the Histadrut. Like, I mean, I could go on about this, how wretched these people are and totally connected to the regime they are. But they do lead strikes, and sometimes there is a lot of dissatisfaction in the Israeli working class over the length of the war. Yes, the Israeli working class remains overwhelmingly very much chauvinist and Zionist. However, cracks are appearing all the time because the war has created such a strain on society. Well, we have to exploit these contradictions and really bring them to bear and really give them a political articulation by connecting the fact that they are oppressed. Israeli workers are oppressed in Israel because of the oppression of the Palestinians. And therefore, they don't necessarily, it's not that they have to love the Palestinian or something, but they can only advance with an alliance with the Palestinian and the Arabs more broadly. And work in the army is also key, which we develop a little more in the article. Another point I would make, we didn't touch on it, but communists must also reach the Mizraim. The Mizraim are the Jews in Israel who are not from European descent. They're from the rest of the Middle East or North Africa. Netanyahu has been able to really mobilize and win over that layer of Jews in Israel who had been discriminated against for years under the rule of liberal Zionism. And he's been able to use the various racial divisions inside Israel, which are very real, to his own genocidal and reactionary purpose. Well, the communists must reach the Mizraim, which are often very much Zionist. However, they are oppressed. They're specifically oppressed with this in Israel. And the case must be made that their oppression will not end by further embracing Zionism as if they can show that they are good Jews, but by actually rejecting it and seeking an alliance with Arab workers. Now, none of this is very easy. I'm not going to pretend that it's like, oh, yeah, but it is necessary. And in fact, it's the only way.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think the current in the left that actually does have a perspective towards the Israeli working class, it is a very, very minority current. So I'm again anticipating detractors, but I think it helps to look outside of that question and to look in other places. There's a thing called false consciousness. That's just a fact of class society. Just because you currently have wrong ideas does not mean that you are incapable of materially fighting on behalf of the oppressed, right? It has to do with your material interests. I always do obviously look at politics from the standpoint of India. You know, right now, lots of Indian workers look to the Hindu chauvinist Modi. There's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment. Are we going to write off, 500 million Hindu workers because they're anti-Muslim today? No, but actually our task is to fight with them and to explain why Hindu chauvinism is actually absolutely detrimental to their own interests and why they must turn to their Muslim class brothers and sisters. It just helps to see things from a materialist standpoint as opposed to like this ideological and moralist standpoint of, oh, well, they're currently have a shitty ideology.
And I think another task in Israel, sort of flowing from you, is to genuine communists must fight within the Israeli left. And the reason the Israeli left is like quite small right now, and the reason why it's also quite discredited in the Palestinian movement for honestly good reason, it's because it has spent decades adapting and embracing liberal Zionism. You'll see it in many ways. The left often is based in like the middle class in Tel Aviv and really imbibe into whether it's this two-state solution or the Green Line. Then, looked at the settler with contempt, etc. And it has really driven a lot of workers in the arms of right-wing like Zionism. So really a key task of communists, I think, is to go to the left in Israel for what's there and really fight for a complete break with Zionism. No adaptation to that ideology. This is really the central obstacle for the unity of Arabs and Israeli workers. It's really the Zionist ideology, and the most of the left in Israel totally concedes it. So it's important to fight in there against that, and also it's important to fight against those communists or those Marxists who are also uncritical of the Palestinian resistance. It's important to, if communism is to be a factor in the Palestinian liberation struggle, it has to demonstrate concretely how the strategy of the current leaders, whether they be nationalist, Islamist, or whatever, is counterproductive, is a dead end, and why a class struggle strategy is better. And on this front, and that's the article you mentioned earlier, 100 Year of Failure, that's really what's been missing for like a century, a communist pole that can really offer a way forward for the struggle for Palestinian liberation, not just in like the future when we have revolution, blah, 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 but right now. How do we go from right now and can offer a class struggle strategy to confront the obstacles that stand in the way and can point to how other strategies are an obstacle? That's really what's missing in Israel, in the broader region in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I just want to conclude this episode by touching on the huge repression that exists against pro-Palestinian forces. Just today, a member of the rap group, the Irish rap group NICAP, he's been charged with terror offenses. There, of course, NICAP is famously pro-Palestine, and they've been slapped with terror offenses. In France, you have huge anti-Palestine repression. A prominent leader of a left group, Anas Kazib, he's been gone after. Another leader of a left tendency, Michael Probsting in Austria. You've got, international students in the US these days who are totally under the gun. So this is a real thing. There's been so many journalists who've been, whose homes have been raided in the middle of the night, that as part of rebuilding the movement for Palestine, also you have to link the defense of all the pro-Palestinian militants and fighters, again, to a proletarian class strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a starting point to rebuild the movement.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's this repression, they're using all the worst sort of weapons in the quote-unquote anti-terrorist arsenal to really go after every sort of expression for the solidarity for Palestine. Like Anas Kazib, he's the leader of the Revolution Permanente in France. He's been dragged into court for apology for terrorism because he tweeted that the European Union stands with butchers. So he just criticized Israel in a tweet, and he faces potentially 7 years in prison. So it's key that the left, the forces of the pro-Palestinian movement, make a common front against that and come together really in defense of these people and against the repression. And I think there is a way to involve the workers' movement in this because, well, often they're trade unionists, people who are repressed, but it's also this repression of the Palestinian movement is part of the broader plan of the bourgeoisie, which is turning away from like liberal values and onward to, openly right-wing reaction as seen with Trump. It's part of a plan to regiment society as a whole, to really crush dissent. And it starts with the Palestinian movement, but it'll go on to Black people, Muslims, trade union activists, and anybody that stands remotely as an obstacle to the project of the bourgeoisie. So there is a basis here to involve the trade union movement against really regimenting society for war and onto right-wing reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really well said. Okay. So I think that brings me to the end of all the questions I had in terms of drawing out the lessons of where are we with the pro-Palestinian struggle? Is there anything that you wanted to conclude with?
I don't know, like the situation is so difficult and it's so hard, every day to just look at this going on. But I really believe that seriously looking at the lessons of the last 19 months, not only helps you to understand, why we're in such a dire situation, but also helps you to understand, well, how can we bring that movement forward, but on a new basis, and advancing it on a new basis? Because it's not enough to just, a lot of people say, oh, just continue to demonstrate, and don't lose hope or whatever, which is all well and fine, but it doesn't help to advance the movement. Why it has hit so much obstacles and been so, sorry, but impotent.
Yep. Absolutely.
So that's all I would add, really.
Yeah, I think that's the only responsible thing to do. That's the only revolutionary thing to do, actually,
Yes.
to stare at reality in the face and have it think. And if you're going to just carry on and cheer and whatever, then you're not actually helping to advance the cause. You're actually building an obstacle to it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if that sounds moralist, but I think that's just a fact.
But that's what a lot of the left has been doing for 19 months. Just yay, let's go. I'm sorry, but this is like, rather than being the vanguard, I think that particularly with the Marxist group and Marxists in the Palestinian movement, I think a lot of them have played a quite wretched role. Rather than being the vanguard, those who can foresee where things go, those who can warn about the pitfalls, those who can, they've really been the rear guard, really serving too often as just foot soldiers for the liberals or the nationalists, organizing the demos and building them, which is all well and fine. You have to do this, but without proposing their own strategy, without warning people that this liberal program is a dead end,
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway.
Okay, well, on that rant, that's it for me. I'll link the relevant articles that we mentioned in the description below. And as always, do follow us on Spartacist ICL on X. And we'll see you or hear from you. Well, no.
Yes, you can check out our YouTube channel as well, Spartacist.
Oh, yes.
I've made a 2-part video which sort of summarizes our article on 100 Years of Failure, Marxist in Palestine. So please do have a look.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, I'll definitely link that in the description. And thank you, Comrade, for joining us to talk about this really, really urgent question.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thanks to you. Always a pleasure.
Okay, well, bye then.
Bye.